Hello, welcome to my book reading channel. I'm Masood Raja, and today I am going to break the usual stereotype that is being associated with the BookTube channels, that they tend to be very Eurocentric or Americocentric. So I'm going to be introducing my first book today, and that is Abeng by Michelle Cliff. Now, this novel was published by Plume Press in 1995, so obviously it's not a new novel, but I would highly recommend that you should read it. And I will briefly now explain the setting of the novel, a little bit about the author, and then without giving you any spoilers, explain what generally the novel is about. And I hope that encourages you to find this novel and read it, and then if possible read its sequel too, which is called No Telephone to Heaven, which was actually published before the prequel. So here we go, our foray into introducing you to the first novel from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, by Michelle Cliff. So Michelle Cliff was originally from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, but also lived in New York and was the lifetime partner of the great poet Adrienne Rich. Not that that's only her claim to fame. I mean, she was a wonderful, highly strong feminist writer in her own right. But that's a little bit about Michelle Cliff. The novel, Abeng, is set in Jamaica, but it plays with different temporalities. Part of the story happens in Kingston, Jamaica, which is the capital city, and then part of the story is set in the rural parts of Jamaica. There is one interesting thing that she does in the novel. So as you read it, the simple plot is the story of a young woman, Claire Savage, who is not yet an adult, and as you read her story, it's a coming-of-age story. It's a Bildungsroman, right? Because by the end of the story, she enters puberty. So in a way, in simplistic terms, you could read it as a coming-of-age story. Now that might bring a question to your mind that, well, would it qualify as a young adult novel? And sadly, no. Because the novel is more than that. It includes also, alongside the main narrative, historical details pertinent to Jamaica that she juxtaposes against the narrative. So what ends up happening is, as you are reading Claire Savage's story through these historical asides, you're also learning the history of colonialism in Jamaica. After all, Jamaica was a British colony. But also the history of the Maroons, right? The escaped slaves who lived freely and fought the British, right? This is some information that most people will not know. And my research shows that this is the information that they even don't teach in Jamaican high schools. So by the time you finish the novel, you know about the Claire Savage families, the Savage family, her father, Mr. Savage, her mom, Kitty. They live in Kingston. They are a mixed race couple. Kitty's mother and Claire's grandmother lives in the countryside. So Claire's experience is in the school as a schoolgirl in Kingston, a colonial school, right? And then when she visits her grandma, it's her experience of literally living in a small house right close to the forest and experiencing country life where she makes her friend Zoe, who is a poor girl and from a working class family. So that's the story that we follow all the way to the end about Claire. But along with it, we also learn how the sugar plantations were run, right? How the Maroons fought, who were their leaders, especially the nanny of the Maroons, the legendary woman, Asante woman, who led the rebellion, how the Maroons had established their own colonies, their own territories, right, and lived there as free freed slaves who had freed themselves. So by the time you finish the novel, you have one linear narrative of our main character, Claire, and her family and the complexities of their country and city life in a colonial setup where the power is still held by the British, both symbolic and material. But along with it, interspersed at different points in the novel, is historical information about Jamaica's history, the history of slavery, even the cane plantations. So by the time you finish the novel, you imperceptibly read Claire Savage and her family within the context of colonialism, slavery, the history of the Maroons, and the history of Jamaica. So what the novel then does is it doesn't just give you a story to read about, it also teaches you to understand Jamaica better historically and culturally. And I think that's what the novel does brilliantly. There is one passage from this novel that I really quote sometimes in my classes. And the way she stages it is that the Savage family is sitting at the table, and Mr. Savage reaches for a spoonful of sugar to put in his tea, right? An innocent act. You, me, and everyone else do it every day probably. But then she connects the production of sugar to the history of slavery and sugarcane plantations. She gives you mathematical information, how many acres produced how much sugarcane, how many slaves had to work how many hours to cut the cane, to grow it, to bundle it, how many slave labor hours did it take to make it into sugar. So by the time you are done with it, by the time she has given you all information, you realize that that simple act of putting sugar in your cup of coffee or in your cup of tea is connected to these atrocious acts, and it's no longer a simple act because it makes you complicit in the project of slavery, in the project of exploitation. And I use that example to teach my students about our own choices in the world. How do we make them, and how we are in so many ways complicit in people's exploitation elsewhere simply because of the choices we make. So these are some of my thoughts about the novel. I highly recommend it. And I'm not going to be like one of those reviewers who says I give it 2 stars or 3 stars. That's not how I function. I'm just here to share with you a little bit of what I know about some wonderful books that I've read and taught. And my hope is that it would encourage you to get the book, read it, and then interact with me. Post your questions in the comments. Anything that you think about, anything that you can relate to after you read the book. So in that sense then, if you are interested in other cultures, if you want to read a story that tries to capture the historical significance of events in Jamaica and tells the story through partially the experiences of a young female character who is coming of age and by the end of the novel has become, if not a fully realized female subject, at least someone who's headed for great things with a complex understanding of her own history and the world around her, then Abeng is the novel. One thing that I forgot, which I should have said in the very beginning, is the title itself. Where does it come from? So Abeng is a word, a native word from the Asante people for the conch shell horn. Now this was the horn that was traditionally used in Jamaica to call the slaves to work, right? Just like a factory horn. But eventually this is also the instrument that the Maroons use to communicate with each other. So that is the significance of the conch shell horn that is called Abeng. So that's all. I hope this was useful to you. As always, please do share your ideas and questions with me, and please do support this newly emerging BookTube channel, which is kind of an unusual channel because I'm talking about books that most people are not talking about. That's all. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.